Good evening, YouTube Live. Greetings in the U.S. across the world. This is my 18th YouTube Live, and I wanted to just discuss the impact, the importance, the significance of the scholarship of independent scholar Jeffrey Perry, who I found out this past Monday. This past Monday, he was an incredible scholar. I was able to sit down, and he handed me this copy of the book he edited called The Hubert Harrison Reader. Please subscribe, like, and share on my YouTube. Tell people about it. Comment. I'm able to see comments. Yes, I'm able to see comments. So please don't hesitate to comment if you're watching this on my Twitter or if you're watching this on my Facebook. Don't hesitate to comment, like, and share, and subscribe. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please share. Please like. Please comment. Really trying to elevate the conversation. This is a copy that Jeffrey Perry himself handed to me. And I remember the last conversation we had in person was when I was in New York in 2012. It was around the time I wrote my dissertation. And um, he, I needed a ride somewhere, and he picked me up from a hospital where I saw my aunt, and he drove me to, I think it was a train station, to the train station to go home, because at that time I was living in Philly. So I just appreciate Jeff Perry. And then he wrote a note in this particular copy of this. Um, this is a Hubert Harrison reader. Did you write a note in this one? Yes. To Rome, with all best wishes. And this was the first day we had met, which was November 12th, 2009. That was the day we met at Columbia University. And by that time, I had seen this and had bought this, his first volume biography of Hubert Harrison. And I first saw Dr. Greg Carr with this book at Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church. That's where I saw Greg Carr. He was talking to Dr. Jones, the director who I was working under. I was in the choir and she was the director, and Dr. Greg Carr was talking to Dr. Jones. And I said, "What is this?" And I noticed he had a copy of this book, and I bought my copy. And wow, this book definitely has influenced the way I read, the way I write. So I'm grateful for Jeffrey Perry for writing this. And on my IG, I just posted the photo with me and him. I wanted to get it a little more clear, trying to get a bigger one. It's about a decent, yeah, that's a better one. But yeah, Jeffrey Perry wrote the two-volume biography of Hubert Harrison, beginning with Hubert Harrison, the voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918, as well as the book he did, and then he passed not even 2 whole years after this second volume, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, which follows his life after he founded his own newspaper called The Voice. Um, and then he passed from appendicitis in 1927. So he wrote very detailed biography, two-volume bio of the life of Hubert Harrison. And if people who don't know, Hubert Harrison, how I introduced him as Garvey's newspaper editor, but he was so much more. He was his own newspaper editor. Garvey met him. By the time Garvey met him, he was already working on his own paper called The Voice. And he's just a remarkable role model. And I thank Jeffrey Perry for writing about him, because without that, there would be no interest in many ways for me in the whole Garvey movement. So I thank Jeffrey Perry for his life, for his scholarship. I wanted to talk about four things. Number one, the structure of how Perry, as an independent scholar, wrote. He talked very comfortably about not choosing not to work in the traditional academy for him. Told me he worked in the post office, and he told me about his time at Columbia. We had two heart-to-heart conversations. The first was in 2009 when he gave me the copy for free of Hubert Harrison Reader, which is a collection of all of Harrison's articles from when the time he started writing in the 19 teens to his passing in 1927. And wow, this this reader, like, I have a bunch of notes, handwritten notes, to the amazing detail with which Jeffrey Perry wrote about Hubert Harrison, but also the amazing life of the mind that that Hubert Harrison lived, And I think what really I want to say before I touch on the 4 points I want to touch on is what Jeffrey Perry reminded me of is the fact that it's not easy to write a biography. And I learned this because Jeffrey Perry wrote a 2-volume biography that each one is at least, 400 pages long. And even though a 400-page biography is written about a person, my point is you still don't know everything there is to know about that person, especially somebody like, excuse me, especially somebody like Hubert Harrison, because he was an autodidact, which means he taught himself, just like Marcus Garvey. He taught himself what he needed to know. He did not get formal training, nor did Malcolm X nor Marcus Garvey. He taught himself what he needed to know. And I want to share with you something that Barbara Ransby, I'm quoting Barbara Ransby now, wrote in her biography of Ella Baker, that is also true of any biography, any biography. And Barbara Ransby writes, in trying to delineate Ella Baker's life and harness and distill it um, in well-ordered chapters, Barbara Ransby writes, I felt her resistance. Powerful. It's her life is much bigger than a book. And her life, Ella Baker's life, like Hubert Harrison's life, is part of a movement. It's part of a greater movement where you can't distill it into one book. There are details that the book will miss. There are details that the book will miss. Barbara Ransby says there was an elegant fluidity about her life that proved to be both the source of her amazing presence and at times a biographer's nightmare. In looking back on the semi-coherence of a life lived, one is humbly reminded that life is an art and not a science. In eavesdropping on Ella Baker's life story, I, Barbara Ransby, found parts of it that made a visceral impact and simply could not be poured adequately into words. Same thing with Hubert Harrison, really same thing about Marcus Garvey. That could not be poured adequately into words, Barbara Ransby writes, as I sought advice from friends, relatives, and colleagues who knew Ella Baker or had themselves researched her life. I was repeatedly reminded that she was bigger than that. She was bigger than that. And so was Harrison. Harrison was bigger than these two, 500 plus page bios about his life. Barbara Ransby says she was bigger than that and that no term or label quite captured her. She was forever shrugging off rather, every definitional shawl Barbara Ransby, tried to gently drape over her shoulders. She really lived outside categories and labels, as difficult as that is for some academics to accept, yet she was still an intellectual with a very coherent, although dynamic worldview. As my jazz aficionado husband would say, Barbara Ransby writes, like Duke Ellington, she was beyond category. Still going back to the beginning of my story of her life, she was both a self-made woman and a product of the world, country, culture, and ideas that surrounded her. And Perry made clear also to tell us the context that Hubert Harrison was in, part of the free thought movement, part of the Lyceum movement. He was definitely, like Ella Baker, part of the culture that surrounded her. Barbara Ransby writes, in celebrating her life, I do not want to mystify or circumscribe it. While, as my son constantly reminds me, we are all products of the multitude of experience, influences, and stimuli that touch us as we struggle to formulate ideas and identities, those experiences are the raw material we then mold into our own unique form. So trying to sum up and repackage a life full of detours, depths, and contradictions, Barbara Ransby writes, is like trying to hold water in your hands. You can feel it, but you can't quite contain it. And I want to be clear that I'm clear that Jeffrey Perry, even in his detailed biography, still could not contain the life of Hubert Harrison in his 2-volume biography. Tony Martin, with his 13-book Marcus Garvey library, still cannot contain the power, the life of Marcus Garvey. And that's a biographer's nightmare. It's not easy to do, but you come close, you try. And then we live in a world where you can respond, you can review, as I wrote a review of his 2nd volume, which talks about its significance in talking about what Hubert Harrison meant to letters, to newspaper publishing from 18 to 27, but also the danger of separating him from the Garvey movement that helped make him, and how that kind of doesn't give us the fuller picture of who he was, because the biographer, by definition, because he or she is writing a biography, has to separate the person from the group. And in most cases, definitely with Garvey and Harrison and Ella Baker, they were all part of a bigger group. So the process of writing a book about one person that's separate from the group is much like what Barbara Ransby writes, trying to contain water in your hands. The hands can't hold it. But we're still grateful for Barbara Ransby's bio of Ella Baker and Jeffrey Perry's biography of Hubert Harrison. Particular part in this book that really speaks to me, that, first of all, I want to say there's a certain structure before I talk about the content of Jeffrey Perry's work. The structure was a big role model to me. I was very impressed with how Jeffrey Perry organized his chapters. Very clean, very neat, very, it was a role model for me, but also how Jeffrey Perry organized his index. In each book, including The Reader, he has Jeffrey Perry has a subject index and he has a title index, which is organized according to the titles of the articles that Jeffrey Perry wrote, that Hubert Harrison wrote. Jeffrey Perry organized his index according to the titles of articles that Harrison wrote, because Harrison was a newspaper editor, not only for Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, for the Pittsburgh Courier, for the Amsterdam News, for so many publications, some of them under Hearst, so many publications that he created a title index. And if I'm not mistaken, there's another type of index. He has a general index, and the index basically covers every single proper noun you could think of. That was not only in The Reader, that was in the 1st volume, and as well as the 2nd volume. Very, very, very detailed indices, plural indices, very detailed indices with very detailed information. So if you just wanted to know about a person in Harrison's life or somebody that Harrison wrote about, go straight to the index and you can find it. And quite often I did that with my very first book about Pauline Hopkins. I wrote that Harrison was one of the first to acknowledge her as a notable novelist in Harrison's work. He was a broad autodidact. He was self-taught, and I want to share I had to pick one page because it's a lot of pages, because I've read every page of Perry's work, but I had to choose one. I just wanted to choose one because I want to be respectful of the consistent time I do on each of these YouTube lives, no more than half an hour. And I just wanted to look at particularly one page from each of his works about Hubert Harrison that really struck me. This is particularly from the 1st volume of Hubert Harrison's life, which covers Harrison's life from his birth in St. Croix, Christiansted, St. Croix, Virgin Islands, 1883. He's a Taurus, same birthday as Dr. Greg Carr and same birthday as August Wilson. Hubert Harrison has that birthday, April 27th. 1883, he was born in Christiansted, St. Croix. But this detail blew my mind that Perry wrote about Hubert Harrison. Perry writes, while he struggled inwardly, Harrison also began to extend his views outward to the larger world of letters and ideas. In the period from 1903 through 1910, he had 12 letters. I thought this was remarkable, absolutely remarkable. He had 12 letters to the editor published in the New York Times, the influential newspaper of record. These wide-ranging letters give clear evidence of his developing race and class consciousness, socialist and free thought beliefs, and familiarity with current events, history, politics, literature, science, and evolutionary history. Absolutely amazing. Don't hesitate to comment on my YouTube. Don't hesitate also to give to my Cash App if you appreciate what you're learning here. An amazing autodidact, self-taught thinker, self-taught writer. Um, my Cash App is $Rome Fraser. And you can see my work. My work is available on Amazon. I have 2 books out. One of them co-edited with Associate Professor Dr. Natalie King Pedroso, Critical Responses about the Black Family, and Toni Morrison's God Help the Child. And my first work is called Pauline Hopkins and Advocacy Journalism, which is a survey of her 4 novels. Who, I don't know any other author around this time, correct me if you know, or comment if you know, who mentions Pauline Hopkins. Hubert Harrison is the only one that I know has quoted Pauline Hopkins, who is from the 19th century. So he's done an amazing work. So this was a page from Perry's chapter called Self-Education, Early Writings, and the Lyceums. The Lyceums were the gatherings. We have online Lyceums now because of the explosion of online bloggers who do kind of the same thing, but the Lyceum was a public forum where they would have public debates. A sort of Lyceum was where Amy Ashwood spoke and where Marcus Garvey chose to introduce himself to Amy Ashwood after seeing her speak at a Lyceum type forum. And Harrison also spoke at Lyceums. Of the A. Hubert Harrison reader text, I wanted to share what was most striking in that work. Yeah. This quote that I have up is from a Hubert Harrison reader, and it's coming from a 1927 article, one of Harrison's last articles, called The Harlem Renaissance. And I mean, this is what Hubert Harrison himself wrote. My previous photo was what Jeffrey Perry wrote about Hubert Harrison having 10 letters to the editor printed in the New York Times. Nobody that I know had that distinction. This was before Garvey came to the country, and this was before he founds his own newspaper. An amazing role model. Harrison's point here is powerful to me because this is so powerful, the point he makes in this article, because he's criticizing the gates. Elizabeth Nunez wrote about the gatekeepers of the publishing industry and how they will allow certain books to be published and other books not to be published. I mean, yes, we have the issue of banned books now. We see a lot of books being unfairly banned, but even before books get published, there's a whole gatekeeping process that Elizabeth Nunez writes about. And Harrison is speaking to this in the late 20s. He writes this 1927 article talking about Zora Neale Hurston, and this criticism is incredible. It makes me, look at Hurston in a new way, and it makes me think about this quote makes me think about who is making the criticism in any piece of art, film, play, novel, who's doing the criticizing, and Harrison makes clear for the readers like myself, it's always important to know who's doing the criticizing. Harrison right here, the right was in prose genuine masters like John Matthias, 357. And the real critics like Frank Horn were swamped, Harrison writes, by the turgid tide of trumpery pish-posh and can hardly be heard for the babble of callow cackling. Many who began with sound artistic impulse but weak wills like Zora Neale Hurston and Helene Johnson were soon swimming with the tide of 10th-rate marketeers, nibbling at the flesh pots of Egypt and headed for oblivion. So Harrison makes a prediction right here in this sentence that Hurston is headed for oblivion because her marketeers, those who market her work, are 10th rate. And by 10th rate, I'm assuming Harrison means they pander to the most ahistorical, sensational aspects of Negro life, something that Perry writes specifically Garvey did in his appeal to the masses, um, that the Garvey movement appealed to the more sensationalistic aspects. And he put, because he's writing about him, he put Harrison on a pedestal and what Harrison is doing and saying that Harrison appealed to the more intellect. But that's up for debate in my mind when you study that period, because Garvey appealed to intellect. He appealed to the spirituality of the masses in talking a lot about the role of God and the role of God in changing society and the role of God in producing social movements. So Garvey was able to really appeal not only intellectually, but also spiritually. But that sentence that Harrison, this is again Harrison writing, is just a mind-blowing sentence. It reminds me of Ishmael Reed's article when he was quoted, I believe, in the New Yorker magazine. The New Yorker did a very extensive piece on all of his novels that I encourage everybody to read. Ishmael Reed was featured in the New Yorker, and he says that the marketers are the ones selling the books. The marketers are the publishers in terms of what is Black art. So he, just like what Harrison is doing, he's getting the reader to question who gets to call Black art, who gets to call art Black, question mark. And that for me was a continuation. Ishmael Reed's point in that New Yorker piece was just a continuation of what Harrison profoundly said in this 1927. I want to get the title of this article. It's called, the one I have up now, Cabaret School of Negro Literature and Art, written by Hubert Harrison, May of 1927. And Jeffrey Perry writes about that in the second volume. Want to take a look at two other pieces, two other very important things that Jeffrey Perry did to bring Hubert Harrison into more full attention. He transitioned on Monday. This is a quote from his second volume biography, and this is Perry's chapter called Editor of the Negro World. Perry writes, the historian Tony Martin considered the most effective of Garvey's propaganda devices to be his newspapers, and the most important of these papers, and possibly the single greatest propaganda device, Jeffrey Perry writes, to be the Negro world. Okay. And Harrison, who you see a photo of here, this is in his second volume biography, this one, was the newspaper editor for 2 years until he wasn't, because of a philosophical disagreement, which Harrison himself makes clear. And Perry quotes Harrison's diary as evidence for, Harrison's belief in why he left the Garvey movement. By 1920, Hubert Harrison chose to leave the Garvey movement, and I wrote a review in the Journal of Caribbean History that just questions some of what Harrison himself said because of, his belief, Harrison's disagreement with how Garvey was running his organization. It still doesn't take away from the incredible influence of Marcus Garvey and the Garvey movement. And so make sure you read his work. We're grateful and we're better, as I put on Facebook My condolences to the family of Jeffrey Perry, his wife's family, his family. I know that Dr. Perry lived in Jersey City, and we were able to meet twice. And the last time I saw Jeffrey Perry was at the 2016 Left Forum, where he was on a panel about that I created called Caribbean Responses to the Cuban Revolution. And he joined that panel with Horace Campbell and several other scholars, Gordon Barnes included. So, an incredible role model. Last important thing that Jeffrey Perry did that is a huge inspiration to me, is he created this gravesite marker when there was none. He talked to me personally about his goal of making this happen, because not too far from where I used to commute on a daily basis, the terminal of the 4 train Woodlawn is the Woodlawn Cemetery. And um, one of Jeffrey Perry's big goals was to make sure that Hubert Harrison had a marked grave. And that is something he accomplished. Jeffrey Perry successfully accomplished. You see the caption here, and this photo and page is from his second volume, The Struggle for Equality. A Hubert Harrison gravesite marker on December 23rd, 2014, 87 years after uh, December 17, 1927, when he passed. Death, a beautiful jet black slant marker with etching was placed on the gravesite of Hubert Harrison in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The intellectual giant known as the father of Harlem radicalism. The marker includes words based on the poem Hubert H. Harrison, written by Andy Razaf, the poet laureate of the militant New Negro movement. The gravesite is located at 13 Grave 100-100 Woodlawn Cemetery, 517 East 233rd Street. And my aunt lived on 233rd Street for years. That's where I lived in 2004 when I lived in the Bronx. The gravesite marker was obtained after people desirous of preserving the history of Hubert Harrison began to organize, including Perry, for that purpose. Ilva Harrison, granddaughter of Hubert Harrison, paid for and chose the image and wording on the marker. So it was mainly his granddaughter, but I know he had helped with it and helped to raise money to make it a reality. But he's saying here that Harrison's granddaughter, Ilva Harrison, helped create that amazing marker. So our awesome role model, Jeffrey Perry, is to me and to several other scholars about what scholarship looks like, how it's structured, and we're all the more grateful. We're all the more grateful. So please, if you haven't already, like my YouTube channel, subscribe to my YouTube channel, um, and share it. Share it with family, friends, and if you appreciated what you were seeing in this YouTube live, don't hesitate to bless my Cash App. My Cash App is $Roan Fraser. Okay. Um, yeah, make sure you read Jeffrey Perry, with a loved one, The Life of the Mind. Hubert Harrison himself lived the life of the mind. Don't underestimate that, because living the life of the mind can enable you to open doors that would not be open were it not for you cultivating the life of your mind. He was an incredible sage. He was an incredible sage that we learn for, and we're all the better for the work of Hubert Harrison. And thank you, Jeffrey Perry, for showing us why his work is important.